On the night of November 8th, 2025, the sky above Ukraine turned black, not from darkness, but from death. 450 attack drones, 45 missiles, one coordinated strike designed to do what 3 years of warfare had not yet achieved: freeze an entire nation. This is the story of Russia's most devastating blow to Ukraine's survival, a calculated assault on a country's ability to survive the coming winter. Welcome to day 1355 of the war that changed everything. By November 2025, Russia's war against Ukraine had entered a critical new phase. It wasn't just about territory anymore. After 1,354 days of fighting, Moscow realized something crucial. You don't need to conquer a nation if you can simply freeze it to death. For 3 consecutive winters, Russia has pursued the same strategy: a brutal campaign to destroy Ukraine's entire energy infrastructure. The goal? Psychological collapse, humanitarian breakdown, forced surrender. Ukraine's power grid was already severely damaged. By mid-2024, Russia had destroyed 9 gigawatts of Ukraine's domestic power generation. That's roughly 50% of the nation's capacity. Civilians were adapting. Generators hummed, solar panels were being installed, underground shelters were being converted to heating centers. But Russia was planning something bigger, something unprecedented in scale. Military analysts knew winter was coming. They knew Ukraine's position was becoming impossible. They knew exactly where to hit: the thermal power plants, the substations feeding nuclear facilities, the gas production infrastructure. One coordinated, simultaneous strike across the entire nation would be designed to accomplish what months of individual attacks could not: a total collapse of Ukraine's ability to survive. At approximately 23:47 local time on November 7th, just before midnight, Russian radar operators confirmed the signal. The strike was authorized. What followed was the largest coordinated attack on Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion began in February 2022. From bases across Russia, Belarusian airspace, and the Black Sea, Russian forces unleashed a synchronized torrent of destruction. Over 450 Shahed kamikaze drones, each carrying explosives, each programmed to find their target in darkness. 45 cruise and ballistic missiles, Caliber systems, Kinzhal hypersonic strikes, Iskander ballistic missiles, all airborne simultaneously. The scale was unprecedented. The coordination was flawless. Ukraine's air defense systems scrambled. F-16 scrambles. Mobile air defense batteries pivoted toward the sky. For hours, Ukraine's defenders fought a desperate battle against mathematical impossibility. 400-plus targets, limited ammunition, finite response time. Ukrainian Air Force Commander Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Ignat would later describe it simply: overwhelming force. By the numbers, Ukraine's defense shot down 406 of 458 drones. That's an 88% interception rate. Exceptional by any standard. But 52 drones got through. The missiles were worse. Of the 45 launched, only 9 were intercepted. That's a 20% interception rate. Russia had overwhelmed the air defense entirely. The targets were precisely chosen and deliberately devastating. Poltava region, direct hit on critical gas production facilities. Kharkiv region, the Zmivska thermal power plant, previously damaged in 2024, struck again. Multiple drones attacking each minute for hours. Kyiv region, the Trypillia thermal power plant, a critical node in Ukraine's entire grid, was targeted systematically. But the most sinister targets weren't the power plants themselves. They were the substations. In western Ukraine, far from any fighting, sit 2 massive nuclear power plants, Khmelnytsky and Rivne. They don't produce electricity to power the war effort. They power civilian life, heating for 40 million people, hospitals, water treatment, Everything. Russian missiles didn't target the reactors. They knew that would cross international red lines. Instead, they targeted the external power substations that keep the nuclear cores cool and prevent meltdown. The calculation was precise. Create a cascade failure of Ukraine's entire energy infrastructure while maintaining plausible deniability about nuclear endangerment. By 6 a.m. on November 8th, the devastation was complete. Kyiv experienced 12 consecutive hours without power. 100,000 residents in Kharkiv lost electricity. Rolling blackouts spread across the nation. The Centrenergo State Energy Company released a statement that would be remembered. Less than a month has passed since the previous strike. Last night, the enemy again hit all of our power generation facilities simultaneously. All thermal power plants operated by Centrenergo were down. Zero output. The plants that had been painstakingly repaired after previous attacks were destroyed again. The cycle was complete. Civilians faced the darkness. Underground shelters that had become heated gathering spaces went cold. Hospitals switched to emergency generators. Water pumping stations shut down. Sewage systems failed. The attacks killed at least 12 people. Dozens more were wounded. 2 people remain missing in Dnipro, buried in rubble from a drone strike on an apartment building. But the real casualty count wasn't measured in bodies. It was measured in gigawatts. Ukraine's energy sector had absorbed its most devastating blow since the war began. Centrenergo stated this was the most extensive attack on its facilities since the conflict began in February 2022. President Zelensky's response was immediate. This is a matter of resources for killing, of money. Sanctions are needed to deprive Russia of the means to continue this war. But even as Ukraine retaliated, launching drone strikes against Russian cities, causing power outages in Belgorod and Voronezh, everyone understood a cold truth. Russia had launched a calculated campaign to weaponize winter itself. The strategy was brilliant in its brutality. Ukraine cannot win this war if its population freezes. Survival becomes the only concern. Fighting becomes secondary. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha issued an urgent warning to global powers. These were not random strikes. They were meticulously planned attacks. Russia is deliberately endangering nuclear safety across Europe. He called on China and India, nations prioritizing nuclear safety, to pressure Russia directly. He demanded an emergency meeting of the International Atomic Energy Agency. The calculations were clear. Ukraine's total power generation deficit was approximately 9 gigawatts destroyed, roughly 50% of capacity. The nation needed 18 gigawatts during peak winter consumption. After November 8th, Ukraine's capacity was now dangerously close to single digits. Emergency measures were implemented nationwide, rolling blackouts scheduled across regions. Industrial operations suspended to prioritize civilian heating and water. Hospitals and critical infrastructure moved to backup diesel generators, expensive, unsustainable long-term. Ukraine's energy minister, Svitlana Hrynchyk, described the reality bluntly. This is one of the largest direct ballistic missile attacks on energy facilities in the entire war. The psychological impact was equally severe. After 1,355 days of fighting, Ukrainian civilians faced the prospect of another sub-zero winter without heat, without reliable electricity, without basic infrastructure. Yet there was no surrender, no collapse. Instead, by November 9th, repair teams were already moving into damaged facilities. Generators were being deployed. Backup systems were being activated. Ukraine was not defeated. It was wounded, but it continued. Russia, meanwhile, faced its own vulnerabilities. Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian cities revealed cracks in Moscow's energy infrastructure. Voronezh, a city of 1 million, reported major power disruptions. Taganrog, on the Sea of Azov, suffered prolonged blackouts. The war was escalating on both sides. Energy infrastructure had become the primary battleground. By November 10, 2025, the reality had crystallized for the global community. This war was no longer primarily about territorial conquest. It was about infrastructure attrition. It was about psychology. It was about who could endure the longest. Russia's strategy was logical, if ruthless. Destroy Ukraine's ability to survive winter, force humanitarian collapse, and wait for political will to fracture. Ukraine's response was equally clear: adapt, repair, retaliate, and persist. Historians would later note that the November 8th attack represented a strategic inflection point. It wasn't the final blow. Russia had attempted similar strategies in 2 previous winters, but it was the most comprehensive. The attack raised urgent questions for the international community. If Russia could deliberately target nuclear power plant infrastructure without immediate military consequence, what was the precedent for the future? Could the IAEA enforce nuclear safety protocols in active warfare? Could international law contain a conflict this brutal? For Ukraine's population of 40 million, the reality was immediate and personal. Winter 2025-26 would be the harshest yet. Civilians would crowd into shared heating centers. Medical emergencies would multiply. Vulnerable populations, the elderly, children, the sick, would face mortal danger from cold. Yet there was something else too. Something that military analysts had consistently underestimated about Ukraine: resolve. For 1,355 days, Ukraine had fought a nation with 3 times its military budget, vastly superior numbers, and technological advantages. On November 8th, Russia believed it had finally broken the power grid and the will of its enemy. By November 9th, Ukrainian repair crews were already assessing damage. By November 10th, partial power was being restored. The energy war would continue. Russia would attack again. Ukraine would repair again. Winter would still come. Suffering would still be real. But there would be no surrender. In the end, the November 8th attack of 2025 proved something that had become increasingly clear over nearly 4 years of war. Military superiority is not the same as strategic victory. The destruction of Ukraine's power grid hurt. It was devastating. It was deliberately cruel. But it did not break Ukraine's will to survive. And survival, when everything else has been taken, becomes its own form of victory. On November 10th, 1,355 days into a war that was never supposed to last this long, Ukraine endured. What comes next will be written by winter itself.